This is the Law Hub podcast brought to you by Law Hub Gambia. On this podcast, we discuss critical and existing institutional frameworks, developments, and processes. Join us as we embark on this exciting journey to learn about trafficking in persons, children's rights litigation in the Gambia, women's absence at the decision-making table, barriers to women's access to justice, women land rights, and strategic litigation in the Gambia. The Law Hub podcast is proudly supported by USAID American Bar Association Initiative through its project on promoting rights and justice in the Gambia. Visit our social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube to catch up on your favorite episodes. Law Hub Podcast, leveraging technology to promote legal literacy and enhance access to justice in the Gambia. Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Law Hub Podcast brought to you by Law Hub Gambia. I am your host, Ndengone Jeng. Law Hub Gambia is a legal knowledge institute that provides free and reliable online access to essential Gambian legal resources for researchers, students, policymakers, the legal community, and the general public. This year, Law Hub Gambia brings you a project titled Leveraging Technology to Promote Legal Literacy and Enhance Access to Justice, with support from USAID American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, through their project on promoting rights and justice in the Gambia. This project is meant to create awareness of the various legal systems in the Gambia, especially with respect to access to justice, women's rights, as well as processes of approaching the Gambian courts, and the specific opportunities and challenges. Law Hub Podcast is one of the activities implemented under this project, created to discuss critical and existing legal and institutional frameworks, developments, and processes. On today's episode, we have Mrs. Aissatou Dabo, Executive Director of the National Agency Against Trafficking in Person. Mrs. Dabo, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers? Tell us about yourself, your career, and what you're currently doing.
Okay, thank you very much, Ngone. It's an absolute pleasure to share this platform with you and to share the knowledge and experience in respect of what we do at the National Agency Against Trafficking in Persons. As you have rightly stated, I am Aissatou Dabo, Executive Director of the agency, and my day-to-day activity centers around the investigations of cases in respect of trafficking in persons, together with the investigation team that we have at NATIB, making sure that we come up with ways and means of enlightening the public on trafficking in persons, and generally coming up with new mechanisms to ensure that we also provide services for victims of trafficking in persons. At a personal level, I am a Gambian. I'm a lawyer by training and have worked in the legal profession, precisely the judiciary, for the past years. Previously engaged in activism. I have a passion for art and business, but I'm currently working at NATIB. Yeah.
Okay. It's an honor to have you here on the platform today. Yeah. And like I said, today we'll be discussing laws governing trafficking in persons in the Gambia. And to begin the conversation, could you please explain trafficking in persons to the layperson? What does it mean?
Okay. That's a very interesting question, a very important one for that matter, in a sense that many a times when you mention trafficking in persons, there might be a bit of a confusion in respect of what it entails. But generally, looking at legal instruments that you have both at the international and at national level, that is precisely the 2007 Trafficking in Persons Act, you would realize that anything that has the three elements that I will subsequently mention would be considered to be trafficking in persons. One is there has to be an act, and that would include the issues of recruitment, meaning someone would come to you and give you a promise to say, for example, I have a job offer that is going to pay you so and so amount. And apart from the act, which is the first element, there has to be a means. And the means would technically either be the use of force, it can be coercion, it can be deceit, more or less like what you would misrepresent to the person to try to convince them to believe that what you're promising is the reality, when in actual fact it's a completely different story.
Yes.
And the third element that would make a transaction or a particular event constitute trafficking in persons would be the purpose. So after there is recruitment using either deceit or other forms of misrepresentation, you would realize that the victim may end up being used for sexual exploitation, may be used for labor exploitation, may be used for different other purposes. And a very new and emerging trend that is coming up is that of organ harvesting. So at the end of the day, if you have these three, then that would be referred to as trafficking in persons. It is important to say that this is clearly different from irregular migration, in a sense that many a times you mention or the back way, and you have a lot of people that would tell you, oh, I had a friend that was trafficked, because they have the preconceived idea or notion that irregular migration is trafficking, but quite different from one another. Because with irregular migration, what happens is there's a contract between one individual to say, pay me this much and I'll take you from so to this other point B.
Yes.
When you get there, what happens is entirely up to you. However, it is important to mention that you can have instances in which a case of irregular migration may end up being a case of trafficking in person, depending on what form of exploitation that person may face, if at all that happens. But there's a fine line between the two of them, but they two completely separate concepts, so to say. Yeah.
Okay, I think that distinction is important because, you know, sometimes you hear someone has gone on the back way and there's an instance where they're being held captive and, you know, they're asked to pay money and whatnot. And, you know, personally, I would think that, okay, maybe that may fall under the, you know, class of trafficking in persons. You know.
Yeah. You can have a situation where, for example, you go to Libya, an example, and the person that you paid to go to Libya, the moment you get there, has literally fulfilled their part of the contract, irrespective of whether it is illegal or not.
Yes.
But when you get there, someone can understand the situation of vulnerability that you're in and use that to traffic you. In a sense that you, for example, you don't have a place to stay. I'm like, okay, you can come and stay with me and then work for me for, let's say, 2 or 3 days. And with this money, you'll be able to use that to cross from Libya to go to where you want to get to.
Yes.
And in that process, you have the element of act, you have the means. And then if you happen to be sexually exploited or exploited by forced labor, so on and so forth, then the purpose comes in. So you end up having a case of trafficking, which had started as a case of irregular migration. Yes.
So, in the context of the Gambia, what's the most common way that people fall into this trap of trafficking in persons?
I think mainly one underlying factor, in a sense, is poverty is key. Being in a vulnerable community is also another aspect. It's not everyone that ends up being trafficked that comes from a poor background. Some people might come from, let's say, very reasonably comfortable backgrounds, but they just want more than what they're experiencing now. And that can result to them being trafficked. Again, the same process. But you realize that in terms of the form of exploitation that they may face, it would depend. But in the Gambia, a lot of the girls, or sometimes even young men that are trafficked out of the country, mostly in the Middle East, mainly face labor exploitation.
Okay.
So for girls that are coming from other countries like predominantly Nigeria, and then Sierra Leone, and then other countries within the sub-region coming into the Gambia, mostly they end up being sexually exploited. So it depending on where you're coming from and where you're going. But with, as I said, Gambians going into the Middle East, Oman, Morocco, Dubai, mostly labor exploitation, but coming into the Gambia, sexual exploitation. Underlying causes poverty. Mainly, yeah. Poverty, vulnerability, ignorance. That may be the issue, because if a lot of people are very much aware of what could look like recruitment and are very cautious of it and know what the red flags are, I believe a lot could be avoided.
Okay. Yeah. I think the education or the awareness bit is pretty important, especially with the job recruitment. People are looking for jobs that would pay them, you know, money that they can survive on. So it's very easy to fall prey to that. But the next thing I would want to ask is, you mentioned the labor exploitation, the sexual exploitation, and in the beginning you mentioned that we have a Trafficking in Persons Act. So what form of protections do we have under the Trafficking in Persons Act that can protect prospective possible victims, but also like people who've already, you know, experienced trafficking in persons?
Yeah, interesting. The Trafficking in Persons Act 2007 does a lot of things for starters.
Okay.
So it is the act that sets up the National Agency Against Trafficking in Persons, clearly spells out the ways in which the agency would be run, its board of directors, what it will constitute, so on and so forth. Again, it is the same act that criminalizes trafficking in persons.
Okay.
So sets out the penalties and also has other provisions in the act that deals with issues of protection of victims. So I'll start with the issue of criminalization of trafficking in persons.
Yes.
So a person who serves as an intermediary in cases of trafficking in persons could be prosecuted under the act.
What's an intermediary?
Yeah, an intermediary would be, for example, if there's a perpetrator in Nigeria and there's someone who is helping to facilitate the transportation of a victim from Nigeria to the Gambia.
Okay.
And then that person could be considered to be an intermediary.
Okay.
And the main perpetrator themselves could also be prosecuted under the act. But this is difficult in cases in which the victims are coming from another country of origin other than the Gambia, because it all started in another country.
Yes.
But the good thing about this is, for example, in Nigeria, NATIB has signed an MOU with NAPTIP Nigeria, and this includes issues of sharing intelligence, sharing information in respect of perpetrators that are maybe of interest to both countries. And in that regard, we can share information with them and they can prosecute that individual in Nigeria where they're not in the Gambia, enabling us to be able to prosecute them.
Right.
Yeah. So other than the main persons, you realize that there are other offenses under the Act that could deal with even transporters. You can also have other provisions in the Act already exist that can deal with the obligations of, let's say, airlines, obligations of companies that deal with transportation. So, but the issue with a lot of these provisions is having the mechanism in place to ensure that you're able to trace what their activities are and clearly set out a strategized system of sensitizing them on what they're supposed to do. And this is important in a sense that, let's use the airlines, for example. They have a duty and an obligation to carry passengers from point A to B. As per the contract, if someone buys a ticket, they have a right to travel. So who are you to stop them for one reason or the other? So the laws in that regard are good and in place, but it's the responsibility of the agencies and other NGOs to make sure that they're able to train the airline operators and then the handlers to know where the line is and be able to strike a balance between their obligations and what they can avoid to not find themselves being caught by the law. And I'm happy to say that before the end of this month, NATIB would be holding the first training for airline handlers in respect of trafficking in persons. And from then on, we will also be training other aviation staff, including steps would be in place to train also other airlines that are not based in Gambia but are operating flights that fly this route. So we have one exception in respect of prosecution, not an exception, but something that should be included, and it's not. And we're hoping that if the Trafficking in Persons Act 2007 is reviewed, we would be able to capture this, and that is to have a provision that will allow us to prosecute persons that are found wanting for organ harvesting. So our law as it is does not have a particular provision that criminalizes trafficking for the purpose of organ harvesting, yes.
Oh.
But the process of reviewing the act has started. We know it does take a while.
It does.
Yes,
it
but
does.
yeah,
Reviewing takes a while.
absolutely. So we're hoping that with that in place, together with other amendments that could be put in, we would factor that during the process of the review. So that is with the issue of the prosecution. I'll come to the issue of victim protection,
Yes.
as you had mentioned earlier. The 2007 Trafficking in Persons Act sets up the provision for the establishment of a victims fund. Now, this would have to go through the process of getting to cabinet, going through parliament, so on and so forth, as clearly spelled out in the act.
Yeah.
Now, what the importance of this is that if the victims fund for trafficking in persons is set up and government dedicates a certain amount of money to this fund, this would allow the National Agency Against Trafficking in Persons to be able to set up structures and also have schemes of support for the victims in terms of repatriation, reintegration packages, forms of sponsorships, and then also allowing them to come up with businesses to help them to be able to do for themselves,
Yes.
so to speak, and more or less like curb the possibility of a reoccurrence of them having themselves been in the position where they would want to find greener pastures elsewhere. This is yet to be done, but NATAPE for the past 3 months have been holding trauma-informed counseling sessions for victims of trafficking in persons, which in effect is the first of its kind. Just a couple of days ago, we were able to have the third session in which 15 victims taken through group sessions and also individual sessions on issues of mental health, taking them through processes that would help them to release what their experience has been. Because it would be interesting to realize that there are victims that were trafficked 7 years ago. They've never shared their story with anyone.
Wow.
Yes, they've never spoken about it, not to their closest family members, not even their parents. And you can imagine how much that has been eating them up on the inside, living with that trauma for that long. So we'll always make sure there's a lot of tissue around.
Yes.
Because, yes,
I can only imagine.
Yes, there's so much emotions, but putting confidentiality at the heart of everything that we're doing, just reassuring them that it's a closed session and this is where the sharing of your experiences stop. And at the end of the discussions, they're free to continue the one-on-one sessions with the social workers that we're dealing with. A couple of them are working with the one-stop centers right now, and they are very experienced in that regard. So we're taking steps in respect of victim support. A lot needs to be done because trafficking is not an easy issue. You always have reoccurring matters, and we continue to identify what the problems are and make sure that we continue to get government to put in the right resources for continued efforts.
Yes, I believe that is really important.
Right,
And based on your response, it seems we have quite a number of people, young women especially, who have experienced trafficking in persons. Is it the same for children? Do we have children who have been victims of trafficking in persons in the Gambia? And if yes, what do the same protections apply to them?
In respect of protection, the same would apply. In most cases, women and children, there are also men who get trafficked.
Okay.
It is one thing that is not spoken about because the male would ordinarily not come out to be outspoken in respect of their experiences as a woman would do. But yeah, the same protection would apply to women, children, and also men. But we do have children as well. But the number of children in respect of Gambians leaving the Gambia for other countries is very minimal based on the statistics that we have at NATAPE.
Okay.
And that is based on the cases that are reported to us and not a global figure. Yeah. But in respect of other nationals that are coming into the Gambia or that are trafficked into the Gambia for sexual exploitation, you do have a good number of them that are under the age of 18, mostly 17, 16, and mostly from Nigeria. Yeah. So a mix of women, children, and then the very minimal figure would be the male group. Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that Gambia is a or could potentially be a trafficking hub for victims of especially sexual exploitation? And if yes, what are the signs that people can look out for in order to, to be able to report when these things occur within their communities?
Yeah. I wouldn't say a trafficking hub because, to be fair, I believe some form of research has to be conducted to be able to evaluate the situation and say, this is the number that we have, and this has been the percentage, and look at the trajectory in that regard,
Yes.
and then have a solid basis to consider it a hub. So I wouldn't say that, but what I would definitely say is that the number needs to be looked into, and we as an agency are continuing to do as much as we possibly can to bring it down, because you still have girls that are still being trafficked into the Gambia on a daily basis. Yeah.
And so that aside, we've talked about the trafficking in persons legislation, the offenses that are in it, and the protections that are in it as well. So, but in terms of prosecution, is the agency responsible for prosecution, or is that under the auspices of the Ministry of Justice or the police? Who's responsible for prosecution, in short? And if yes, have there ever been any convictions on trafficking in persons?
That's another issue that has been considered as part of the review process of the Act.
Okay.
Because NATIP is given the mandate to investigate, but the agency does not have prosecutorial powers. So what happens is that when we investigate, the investigation report moves to the Ministry of Justice for legal opinion, and depending on what the outcome of the opinion is, then they would have to file a bill of indictment at the High Court to prosecute the matter.
Yes.
We're hoping that what could happen is a situation like we have at the Drug Law Enforcement Agency, where the agency has prosecutory powers and then also has in-house counsel who can deal with the process, because this is very important in a sense that it will expedite the process of prosecution. You, in most cases, dealing with victims that are non-nationals and they want to go back home, and the longer they stay in the Gambia, the more expensive it is on government, because you need to deal with their shelter, you need to deal with their feeding. Sometimes the food that they eat here is different from their diet. You know, there can be tantrums here and there. Victim care in itself is very difficult.
It is difficult and it's expensive.
Exactly. So the more we're able to expedite the trial process, the better. And this is a development that the Minister of Justice has been very supportive with initiatives that have been brought up by NATIP. And we hope that when the review process of the Act is in place, we'll be able to do things a lot faster in respect of prosecution. And convictions, yes, this year, 2023, we have secured convictions for 2 people. And they are both currently serving a term of imprisonment of 15 years at the State Central Prison, Smile 2. So one was Jennifer Ozwem, and then the other was Jerome Jata, and they are both trafficking cases. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's how would I put it? It's good news.
Yeah.
It's good news to know that at least some of the perpetrators are paying for their crimes. Yes.
Right.
I believe that is very welcome news.
Yeah.
But aside from not having powers to prosecute cases, having to rely on the state or the police to prosecute cases, are there any other barriers to implementing the trafficking laws in this country?
Yeah. In respect of implementation right now, the only barrier there could possibly be is like every other project that you would have. Financial limitations would always pop up here and there.
Yes.
Trafficking is can be very expensive in a sense that just repatriation in itself can cost you over $250,000 for one individual.
Wow.
Because especially for Gambians that are in the Middle East, most of the time when they're sold, so to speak, their bosses there pay a certain amount for them. Let's say $170,000 equivalent. So if you want to bring them back, they would demand that this is how much I paid for her to the agent, so I need my money back.
What?
So you can, yes, so you can imagine that amount plus the cost of air ticket, the cost of accommodation in the interim until such time they are repatriated. So that can cost quite a lot. But again, I believe it's worth it if the resources are available.
Yes.
You can never put a price tag on any individual, irrespective of what the situation is. But yeah, just to say to all donors and government that trafficking in persons is a serious matter, and no amount is small, and no amount is too much. Because if you're looking at an approach that has to deal with prevention, has to deal with protection, has to deal with prosecution, even partnership, despite the fact that partnerships is bringing in money, but you need money to foster partnership.
You do.
So you realize that across the 4 Ps, you're always looking for financial resources to be able to conduct awareness raising. Even printing of T-shirts are even expensive.
Everything is expensive.
Yes.
So, running a project is expensive.
Yes. So, and it's an ongoing project, because trafficking is not stopping anytime soon.
No.
We're just trying our best to combat it, being very well aware that the more we do, the more innovative the perpetrators are going to be. So I was speaking to a government official, and one thing he said to me that I will always remember was, trafficking is not going to get easier, but we have to get better at what we do.
Yes.
And that simply summarizes it. More resources, more concrete strategies to combat it, with effective means of monitoring and evaluation. And hopefully we will get somewhere soon.
It is absolutely right that it's not going to get easier with the advancements being made on technology on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
I believe it would get trickier. To intercept trafficking victims. And the situation you described, it's like you're basically buying back
that's
the victim just to save their life, which there's no amount of money that you can equate to human life. But it's crazy that
it is crazy. And you mentioned technology, and that is just making things a lot more difficult, because you would realize, and this is the same for a lot of people that are on social media, an ad would pop up, or we're recruiting $500 a week, $500 a day, £1,000 a day. So these are all things that are very enticing, so to speak, and for any individual that wants better for yourself, you would consider it.
Yes.
And to tell you the truth, there are people that are educated and that have looked at this one or two to say, oh, if I can do this on the side, this can get me some more money.
Yes.
But again, these are some of the tricks and the traps and the innovative means of recruitment that are emerging. So it's a high time, together with what we already have to deal with, look at issues of cybersecurity and how best we can enlighten people of being very cautious of some of these recruitment schemes that are emerging. Not to say everything that comes up in that light is deceitful. Some are very legitimate.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's good to know how to recognize the red flag when you see it. Yeah.
I think that's a good segue into what I was going to ask next, which is that what are some of the signs that people can look out for, to see something and be like, okay, this may actually not be a legitimating. It may be a trap to, traffic me. What are some of the signs that, from your experience, you've learned about?
One thing I'll say first is, if it's too good to be true,
it is true. It's probably not legit.
Just look it through. And it's also important to not be engaged in these transactions in isolation. Because traditionally, and just with our cultural settings, when it has to do with travel, people are very keen on nobu.
Yeah, very hush-hush about it.
Don't tell anyone, this is about traveling, you can't tell anyone. But again, that can be what would save you.
Yes.
And always ensure that you look out for how transparent the person you're dealing with is. Sometimes even the person that you're dealing with can tell you, oh, you can't tell anyone about this.
Yes.
So that is a red flag.
That is a red flag.
Yeah. And always request to speak to persons or individuals that have gone through the process successfully. If they're able to say, oh, this is this person, call them and speak to them. and not have themselves involved and allow you to independently authenticate what is it that they're telling you, then that can help. Yes, we hopefully in the coming year we would be able to develop a system in which anyone that wants to travel through either a recruitment agency, either for labor purposes or whatever, you can just double check to see if they're legitimate.
Yes.
And this would have all recruiting agencies be in a position where if you want people to trust what you do, then have registered
with the
NATIP,
agency,
you know.
yes.
And there's a lot that needs to be done. But good thing is we're aware of these trends, and then we know that it's a time bomb and something needs to be done as soon as possible. But mainly request for references, one.
Yes.
Two, if it's too good to be true, then have second thoughts. And three, don't be hush about it.
Yes.
Yeah, don't try to speak to someone and get ideas or consult to verify or authenticate before you invest or even get on that plane.
Yes.
Because it can be dangerous.
It really can.
Yeah.
It could cost you your life.
Absolutely.
Literally, it could cost you your life.
Yeah.
So we've spoken at length about trafficking in persons, you know, the offenses, the protections, and the challenges that we're experiencing in the Gambia in handling the issue. And like we've said, it's something that is not about to end anytime soon. So what recommendations do you have in terms of how we can make it easier to trace cases of trafficking in persons, but also to prosecute cases and victim support as well, which I think is very important.
Okay. Thank you, Ngone. The recommendations, I'll be brief in a sense that first of all, I'd like to say NATIP has a toll-free line, and we could be reached on 1123. That is 1123, yes. The number is accessible 24/7. It's a mechanism that allows victims and the general public at large to be able to report cases of trafficking in persons without fear of discrimination. And generally, if you don't want to be identified, it's just a simple way of doing things. And again, just to call on the public to be very vigilant, and they can help us make the job easier. So if our investigations are taking a proactive and a reactive method, what we need is persons to be able to report cases of trafficking to allow NATIP to be able to investigate them. Many a times we'll tell you, oh, we have cases, but then we don't know what has been done about these cases. But the truth of the matter is that we as Gambians are the very ones that are renting out these properties to the perpetrators that are trafficking the girls into the Gambia to be engaged in sexual exploitation. It is our very own Gambian sisters and brothers that are running more or less like brothels in the country with girls from upcountry, girls from within the urban area, girls from other countries within the sub-region working as sex workers. Gambians are doing that. So if you're in a particular neighborhood and you realize that there's so many girls there that have been sexually exploited, not everyone that is in sex work is voluntarily doing it.
Especially the younger ones.
Especially the younger ones. You may see them along Bijilo, Kololi, the Senegambia area and be like, oh, these are very young girls that are engaging in sex work. But there's, in many cases, a story behind that moment in which they're standing there soliciting.
Yes.
So we have to be vigilant. We need to report cases and not create that enabling environment for the exploitation of these young girls. And equally to continue to call on support from the partners. With partnership, everything is achievable. And I'm hoping that with the ongoing efforts that have been put in place at NATIP, with the support of the Ministry of Justice and the Gambia government by extension, we would register a lot of success in respect of trafficking in persons in the not too distant future. But be vigilant, it's key.
Yes. Be vigilant. And remember, the toll-free line for NATIP is 1123. It's free. Toll-free means you don't need credit to call. You can call at any time of the day to report a suspected case of trafficking in persons. And I believe it's important for that information to be out there, especially like she said, some of these victims live within our community. Some of them are renting properties, in our homes. So we need to be very vigilant and report suspected cases. So reporting doesn't mean that the person would get arrested immediately, but it would give the authorities a chance to investigate and find out if this is really a case of trafficking and then provide support to the victims.
Yeah. And just to say one more, sometimes people don't want to report cases because they have this fear that they would be exposed, that they are the ones that reported the matter. But just to say, if you report, it's done in complete confidentiality. No one would know that you reported the matter. And just because you reported a case doesn't mean that the person that you reported will end up being prosecuted, because your report is mainly giving us a basis to investigate and look further into the matter. And even where the case goes to court, you will not be required to come to court to give evidence or to serve as a witness simply because you reported the matter. So just to say, anyone that's planning on reporting, you're safe. You will not be exposed. Yes.
On that note, we conclude today's podcast on the laws governing trafficking in persons in the Gambia. It was a pleasure having you here, Aissatou. We've learned a lot from your experience serving as Executive Director of NATIP. And I hope that the information we've shared, especially in terms of how to pick out or how to notice possible cases of trafficking, but also how to report cases, would be something that would be valuable to those watching, and those listening to this podcast. As we said in the beginning, I am your host, Ndengone Jeng. This is Law Hub Podcast, brought to you by Law Hub Gambia and produced by Right Click. See you on the next episode and have a good day.